think at the moment there is a heck of a lot to play for, and we need to focus on what is happening in our own backyard. And our own backyard is the Russian attack into Ukraine and beyond. Similarities between 1939 and what we're seeing now are so stark that you'd almost think that Putin and Hitler have exactly the same playbook. I think it was very interesting. The head of the German intelligence, to me, sort of said two things. First of all, that we have intelligence that the aims of Russia and Putin do not stop at Ukraine, and they will expand beyond that. Actually, Putin has been telling us for years that his aims go beyond Ukraine. In effect, he wants to re-establish the borders of the old Soviet Union. Interesting enough, all of those countries, like the Baltic countries, Poland, Romania, etc., do not want to become part of the Russian Federation. The other critical thing, I think, that the head of German intelligence said was they believed that the Russians didn't believe that NATO was still a coherent force that was coordinated enough and working closely together enough to actually fight together in an Article 5 situation. Article 5 is where if one country is attacked, all the others go in. And President Trump, I expect, carries a lot of the blame for this, because I think we on this side of the Atlantic Ocean don't believe that the Americans would pile in. There's a lot of talk of Russian buildups in the north of Europe, along the sort of Estonian border and also the Finnish border too. When you look at it from a military perspective, a hook north from Russia would sort of make sense. I mean, we're doing a lot of similarities between the Russians and the Nazis in the Second World War. Of course, when the Nazis attacked eastwards in 1939 and 40, a sort of sickle type way they attacked, we call it the horns of the bull, going round the top or under the bottom, can be incredibly effective. And the way that the Nazis hooked through the Ardennes, the impenetrable forests, to attack into and really unhinge the Allies in 1940 is, you can sort of see a similar sort of attack round the top of NATO through Estonia sort of makes sense, and would also allow the Russians to quickly perhaps meet up with their fleets in the Baltic Sea. But again, I think this is classic propaganda and disinformation. The Russians are trying to shape the battlefield, if you like. And conversely, of course, the German Secret Intelligence Service is trying to counter that and make sure that we're all aware of it. And, the head of the Secretary General of NATO's visit to London yesterday, and what he said is very much sort of backing up that sort of line.
We would not go to the 5%, including the 3.5% core defense spending. You could still have the National Health Service, or in other countries their health systems, the pension systems, etc. But you'd better learn to speak Russian.
I think you must remember that Mark Rutte was he describes himself as a liberal politician. He was Prime Minister of Holland for 14, 15 years. He's the last sort of person you would intuitively think, come to a country like Britain and tell us we need to spend 5% of our GDP on defence, otherwise we'll be speaking Russian. It's all about deterrence. And if we go back to the head of the German intelligence service, he said Ukraine is just a stepping stone for the Russians and Putin. Therefore, whether it's Estonia next or Finland or whoever, unless there is something more than there is at the moment to dissuade Putin from coming further west, then that is the position we're going to be in. And I think Mark Rutte also wanted to emphasize that actually Article 5 is absolutely still alive and real. And that was almost more for Moscow than London. And we are in this sort of grey zone, this shadow world where intelligence and the interpretation of intelligence is so very, very important. Those people analysing intelligence in the Kremlin must be telling Putin that, Article 5 exists. NATO is about to spend trillions of euros on defence. This is as far as we can go. That must be what is trying to be achieved here. What one has to look at, and I'm sure NATO planners are looking at all these particular areas, and no doubt that's why the Russians are leaking this sort of information out, because they want to give things for NATO to think about. But certainly one would expect the Russians to use Belarus, because in effect that gets them much more closer to their aims. And if they break through that corridor into Kaliningrad, in effect, they haven't quite split NATO in two, but certainly a third and two-thirds, if you like, because in effect you would have the Baltic states and Finland and Sweden to the north, as it were, and the rest of NATO to the south. So, and the link up, I think, to the Baltic Sea, where the Russian fleet could go, is, it sort of makes sense. But one has to also look at it. If I think if NATO did nothing now, and Russia continued to build up its military capability, it is a military economy at the moment. They are just building, tanks where they used to build plowshares, sort of thing. So yeah, certainly in 4 years they could create a hell of a lot more military capability. Be it imperialism, communism, or the sort of pseudo-communism that perhaps you have at the moment, the oligarchs and the gangsters. It's all pretty similar. And Putin has not been shy of telling us, what he wants. He sees himself as the Peter the Great of the 21st century, and he is driven to reconstruct the Soviet Union. But he has created a society in Moscow, the Kremlin, and in Russia, where his dreadful ideas can thrive and develop. And I suppose when you surround yourself with powerful people, and if you enable them to earn enough money, then they are going to keep backing you. And when the rank and file are used to have been kept down and shackled to the plough, as it were, then the chance for revolution is few and far between, and the chance for people to revolt. I mean, any protests in Moscow are very, are not allowed to happen. Just look at Alexei Navalny, who was, I expect most people in Russia would prefer to see him as a sort of quasi-democratic leader. But, first of all, they tried to assassinate him with the deadly nerve agent Novichok. And then when he did come back to try and stake his claim as the opposition, in effect, they took him to the Arctic and murdered him. So it's, hopefully people in this country realize, what the whole Russian system is about, and why we need to listen to people like Mark Rutte, who tell us we need to defend ourselves, otherwise we will be speaking Russian. I don't agree with a lot of what President Trump says, but his line that sort of Russia is Europe's problem, I think in that case he's probably right. The last thing NATO and we want to be dealing with is any threats from China, or any direct threats, small threats in the Middle East from Iran. And perhaps in the past Britain can be criticised from trying to be the world's policeman and doing what in effect we've sort of expected America to do for the last 20 years.